seen a proposition that has been disingenuous in terms of how they engage with the comparative. Because when they make arguments saying that people need to have control over the decisions that governments make, they neglect the fact that our model in opposition is not to have no consultation whatsoever. In fact, it's to consult the voice of civilians in accordance with the voice of experts, other industry groups, unions, workers, all of these actors who are also affected by FTAs. But beyond the fact that their arguments simply don't engage with the comparative, they have shifted their case multiple times in the second speech. The point at which they tell you that FTAs are unique for needing direct democracy, but then saying we would also have it for foreign policy agreements, means that they're saying that clearly in the status quo it isn't working, although they haven't been able to prove to you that it isn't. So what we say to you in opposition is they have been disingenuous, they've shifted their case, but they haven't been able to prove to you why FTAs are unique and why you get better free trade. In this speech, refutation of everything you get from Prop, and then a new constructive point about why this actually has a negative impact on foreign relations. Getting into refutation, the first major idea we get from Prop is that foreign trade agreements need direct democracy. Recognize that we use representative democracy for all other decisions. So they need to tell you why FTAs are unique, given that there are no major harms in terms of legitimacy or any of the other things they tell you about the decisions that we currently let our government make. What are the claims that they give you thus under this point? Firstly, foreign trade agreements are unique because they cede sovereignty. People have a claim to self-determination, as the second speaker builds upon this point saying, regardless of outcome. We have several responses. Firstly, we challenge the assumption that self-determination is a good in and of itself. What we would say is the reason why we give people control over their own decisions is because we recognize that people know best what a good life is for themselves. So that means that they can choose what a better quality of life means to them. The point at which we can prove to you that they can't choose a better quality of life for themselves and for their country is the point at which that self-determination just isn't useful. They haven't contested that fundamental assumption. But second of all, so does every single other decision in terms of ceding sovereignty that government makes. So when we ask about foreign policy, for instance, when a government decides to enter the United Nations or to partake in a multilateral organization like the ICC, for instance, that is also ceding sovereignty, and yet we make and let governments make those decisions. They shift their stance when in their first speech they say in response to a POI, no, we wouldn't have this for foreign policy. In their second speech they say, yes, we would. It is unclear why they're making this outcome change. But second of all, given that free trade agreements have such a huge impact on these populations that they concede sovereignty, the question becomes who is the best actor and who can make the best and most informed decision for these populations. What we would say is these referenda actually minimize the autonomy of people in the long run if you believe that autonomy is important. For all the reasons that Rory gives you, if these referenda are to have any sway or any impact, they must be legally binding. Meaning you can't go back and change them even if people want to. I'm going to prove to you my constructive moreover why it means you can't have future free trade agreements. Second claim under the principle is that this serves the interest of the elite. The first claim under this is that lobby groups have a disproportionate influence. Okay, so first of all, this argument assumes that lobby groups are the only influence on politicians. This isn't the case, recognizing that politicians also have to compromise with voters, other interest groups like unions, workers groups, and other politicians they have to compromise with. Given that at some point a decision that they're going to make is going to be bad for some actor, this leaves politicians the space to think, it's going to piss off somebody, so I might as well think about, is this actually a great decision for our economy? But second of all, they just assert that lobby groups are a bad thing. I actually think they're a really good thing in a lot of cases. The reason is twofold. One, free trade agreements first and foremost affect industry. If you don't consult them, they could be hurt, businesses could be forced to shut down or relocate, but there are also interest groups who represent workers, conservationists, other industry actors that we need to be representing. But thirdly, we think that if lobby groups have a disproportionate influence, it gets worse under their side of the house. The reason for this is, if there are lots of free trade agreements, there are going to be lots of referenda. It is expensive to campaign as a lobbyist group who now has to campaign directly to the population versus to the government through campaign financing. That means that the only voices that are now heard are those of the most expensive, the most profitable, the most lucrative lobbyist groups, rather than the alternative mechanisms we can have, like limiting campaign financing. These are the groups that prey on the poor people that side proposition wants to protect, and that sway and have a disproportionate influence on the voting outcome. The next claim that we get is that FTAs are conducted in secrecy, and this is a bad thing. So recognize that negotiations are still secret on proposition. So we think that given that, most of the information isn't accessible to the average person, versus on our side of the house, we can pressure those governments to be more open in terms of the consultative process that we actually propose under our side. The next claim that they give is we need to give power to the people because they're directly impacted by free trade agreements. audience, so particularly the poor. This is a really nice sounding argument. It sounds like we ought to give people because they're directly impacted by policy. But they never prove to you why their mechanism gives power to the people, given all of the impacts that Rory tells you about how people just can't make choices that are in their best interest all the time. To give you an example illustrating this, when the Philippines had a referendum in 1939 about whether or not to increase tariffs on their sugar industry, 97% of the largely poor population voted in favor of it. It proceeded to devastate their economy. What they do when they respond to this point is they drop all the nuance that is so-called paternalistic of Rory's argumentation, where she tells you that in a lot of cases there's low voter turnout, that there's a self-selecting mentality where you surround yourself with other people who have the same preconceptions as you do, where you have biased factual claims thrown at you. It's probably not true that all the information that UKIP gave British voters was accurate, so they haven't proven to you why people can sort out this information and make a reliable choice. We can't just make people more educated. I don't know what that mechanism is. When there are structural problems in the system, we have a consultative process. Finally, last thing I want to deal with is if they get better free trade agreements that reduce structural inequality. I want to point out that there's a case tension here when they tell you that they support FTAs, but then they also say that they're so harmful to the point in which you lose jobs and have massive structural inequality. You need to choose which one they support. But second of all, we don't think that we're talking about the developing world in this case. The reason for this is that we think that governments in those countries can easily rig elections. They can force people into voting a particular way, which means you don't get much change on either side. We're talking about systems where there is accountability both in the government and among the populace. Getting into constructive, I want to talk about why you have a negative impact on foreign relations. The premise of this argument is that FTAs require governments to make concessions in order to achieve an agreement. This is because FTAs have to be mutually beneficial for all parties involved. There are two implications of this. Firstly, FTAs require a lot of planning in advance. They take a lot of time. NAFTA, for instance, took 4 years. But second of all, and more importantly, FTAs require governments to expend significant political capital. This is because every country has industries they want to protect, perhaps because they have significant lobbying influence. So for instance, for Japan, it could be their car industry. This means that in order to make concessions, countries are going to have to appease some of these industries and ultimately make decisions that are going to hurt some of their domestic industries. What happens when you pass this motion? Before governments are willing to start negotiations, they have to tell the other countries, I assure you that my population will vote yes to passing this agreement. Why? Because no country wants to invest time, resources, political capital, strain relations with their domestic industry leaders for nothing. What happens when you pass this motion? If the population votes no, then it makes it seem like all of that progress was for absolutely nothing, which means that these countries are less likely to be willing to come to the negotiating table in the long term. The reason for this is because they had to make concessions versus perhaps they voted in favor of a free trade agreement versus another country didn't. They had to sacrifice ties with domestic industries, and now they don't even get the benefits of that agreement. This is incredibly important because if you believe that autonomy is important, we've proved to you that you're less likely to get FTAs in the long run, that you cancel out the option of being able to come back to that bargaining table to look at different terms of the agreement and to come to better terms for everyone. On that basis, we oppose.